welcome to Back to the Book. It's time to relax and enjoy some of the finest literature ever written in English. In Cranford, by Elizabeth Gaskell, we've reached a point of panic in the town, so if you're sitting comfortably, I will begin. Lady Glennmire, who had evidently taken very kindly to Cranford, did not like the idea of Mrs. Jamieson's going to Cheltenham, and more than once insinuated pretty plainly that it was Mr. Mulliner's doing, who had been much alarmed on the occasion of the house being attacked, and since had said, more than once, that he felt it was a very responsible charge to have to defend so many women. Be that as it might, Mrs. Jamieson went to Cheltenham, escorted by Mr. Mulliner, and Lady Glennmire remained in possession of the house, her ostensible office being to take care that the maidservants did not pick up followers. She made a pleasant-looking dragon, and as soon as it was arranged for her to stay in Cranford, she found out that Mrs. Jamieson's visit to Cheltenham was just the best thing in the world. She had let her house in Edinburgh, and was for the time houseless, so the charge of her sister-in-law's comfortable abode was very convenient and acceptable. Miss Pole was very much inclined to install herself as a heroine because of the decided steps she had taken in flying from the 2 men and 1 woman whom she entitled "that murderous gang." She described their appearance in glowing colours, and I noticed that every time she went over the story some fresh trait of villainy was added to their appearance. One was tall. He grew to be gigantic in height before we had done with him, and of course had black hair, and by and by it hung in elf-locks over his forehead and down his back. The other was short and broad, and a hump sprouted out on his shoulder before we heard the last of him. He had red hair, which deepened into carroty, and she was almost sure he had a cast in his eye, a decided squint. As for the woman, her eyes glared, and she was masculine-looking, a perfect virago, most probably a man dressed in women's clothes. Afterwards we heard of a chin on her beard, and a manly voice and stride. If Miss Pole was delighted to recount the events of that afternoon to all inquirers, others were not so proud of their adventures in the robbery line. Mr. Hoggins, the surgeon, had been attacked at his own door by 2 ruffians, who were concealed in the shadow of the porch, and so effectually silenced him that he was robbed in the interval between ringing his bell and the servants answering it. Miss Pole was sure it would turn out that this robbery had been committed by her men, and went the very day she heard of the report to have her teeth examined and to question Mr. Hoggins. She came to us afterwards, so we heard what she had heard straight and direct from the source, while we were yet in the excitement and flutter of the agitation caused by the first intelligence, for the event had only occurred the night before. "Well," said Miss Pole, sitting down with the decision of a person who has made up her mind as to the nature of life and the world, and such people never tread lightly or seat themselves without a bump. "Well, Miss Mattie, men will be men. Every brother son of them wishes to be considered Samson and Solomon rolled into one, too strong ever to be beaten or discomfited, too wise ever to be outwitted. If you will notice, they have always foreseen events, though they never tell for one's warning before the events happen. My father was a man, and I know the sex pretty well." She had talked herself out of breath, and we should have been very glad to fill up the necessary pause as chorus, but we did not exactly know what to say, or which man had suggested this diatribe against the sex, so we only joined in generally, with a grave shake of the head and a soft murmur of, "They are very incomprehensible, certainly." "Now only think," said she, "there I had undergone the risk of having one of my remaining teeth drawn, for one is terribly at the mercy of the surgeon dentist, and I, for one, always speak them fair till I have got my mouth out of their clutches. And after all, Mr. Hoggins is too much of a man to own that he was robbed last night." "Not robbed!" exclaimed the chorus. "Don't tell me!" Miss Pole exclaimed, angry that we could be for the moment imposed upon. "I believe he was robbed, just as Betty told me, and he is ashamed to own it, and to be sure it was very silly of him to be robbed just at his own door. I dare say he feels that such a thing won't raise him in the eyes of Cranford society, and is anxious to conceal it, but he need not have tried to impose upon me by saying I must have heard an exaggerated account of some petty theft of a neck of mutton, which, it seems, was stolen out of the safe in his yard last week. He had the impertinence to add he believed that it was taken by the cat. I have no doubt. If I could get to the bottom of it, it was that Irishman dressed up in women's clothes who came spying about my house with a story about the starving children. After we had duly condemned the want of candour which Mr. Hoggins had evinced, and abused men in general, taking him for the representative of type, we got round to the subject about which we had been talking when Miss Pole came in, namely, how far in the present disturbed state of the country we could venture to accept an invitation which Miss Mattie had just received from Mrs. Forrester, to come as usual and keep the anniversary of her wedding day by drinking tea with her at 5 o'clock and playing a quiet pool afterwards. Mrs. Forrester had said that she had asked us with some diffidence, because the roads were, she feared, very unsafe, but she suggested that perhaps one of us would not object to take the sedan, and that the others, by walking briskly, might keep up with the long trot of the chairman, and so we might all arrive safely at Overplace, a suburb of the town. No, that is too large an expression. A small cluster of houses separated from Cranford by about 200 yards of a dark and lonely lane. There was no doubt but that a similar note was awaiting Miss Pole at home, so her call was a very fortunate affair, as it enabled us to consult together. We would all much rather have declined this invitation, but we felt that it would not be quite kind to Mrs. Forrester, who would otherwise be left to a solitary retrospect of her not very happy or fortunate life. Miss Mattie and Miss Pole had been visitors on this occasion for many years, and now they gallantly determined to nail their colours to the mast, and to go through Darkness Lane rather than fail in loyalty to their friend. But when the evening came, Miss Mattie, for it was she who was voted into the chair as she had a cold, before being shut down in the sedan like Jack-in-a-box, implored the chairman, whatever might befall, not to run away and leave her fastened up there to be murdered, or even after they had promised. I saw her tighten her features into a stern determination of a martyr, and she gave me a melancholy and ominous shake of the head through the glass. However, we got there safely, only rather out of breath, for it was who could trot hardest through Darkness Lane, and I am afraid poor Miss Mattie was sadly jolted. Mrs. Forrester had made extra preparations in acknowledgment of our exertion in coming to see her through such dangers. The usual forms of genteel ignorance as to what her servants might send up were all gone through, and harmony and preference seemed likely to be the order of the evening, but for an interesting conversation that began I don't know how, but which in relation, of course, to the robbers who infested the neighbourhood of Cranford. Having braved the dangers of Darkness Lane, and thus having a little stock of reputation for courage to fall back upon, and also, I dare say, desirous of proving ourselves superior to men, in the article of candour, we began to relate our individual fears, and the private precautions we each of us took. I owned that my pet apprehension was eyes looking at me, and watching me, glittering out from some dull, flat wooden surface, and that if I dared to go up to my looking-glass when I was panic-stricken, I should certainly turn it round with its back towards me for fear of seeing eyes behind me looking out of the darkness. I saw Miss Mattie nerving herself up for a confession, and at last out it came. She owned that ever since she had been a girl, she had dreaded being caught by her last leg just as she was getting into bed by someone concealed under the bed. She said when she was younger and more active, she used to take a flying leap from a distance, and so bring both her legs up safely into bed at once. But this had always annoyed Deborah, who piqued herself upon getting into bed gracefully, and she had given it up in consequence. But now the old terror would come over her, especially since Miss Pole's house had been attacked. We had got quite to believe in the fact of the attack having taken place, and yet it was very unpleasant to think of looking under a bed and seeing a man concealed, with a great fierce face staring out at you, so she was bethought herself of something. Perhaps I had noticed that she had told Martha to buy her a penny ball, such as children play with, and now she rolled this ball under the bed every night. If it came out on the other side, well and good. If not, she always took care to have her hand on the bell rope, and meant to call out John or Harry just as if she expected menservants to answer her ring. We all applauded this ingenious contrivance, and Miss Mattie sank back into satisfied silence, with a look at Mrs. Forrester as if to ask for her private weakness. Mrs. Forrester looked askance at Miss Pole, and tried to change the subject a little, by telling us that she had borrowed a boy from one of the neighbouring cottages, and promised his parents 100 weight of coals at Christmas, and his supper every evening for the loan of him at nights. She had instructed him in his possible duties when he first came, and finding him sensible, she had given him the Major's sword — the Major was her late husband — and desired him to put it very carefully behind his pillow at night, turning the edge towards his head of the pillow. He was a sharp lad, she was sure, for spying out the Major's cocked hat. He had said if he might have that to wear, he was sure he could frighten 2 Englishmen or 4 Frenchmen any day. But she had impressed upon him anew that he was to lose no time in putting on hats or anything else, but if he heard any noise, he was to run at it with his drawn sword. On my suggestion that some accident might occur from such slaughterous and indiscriminate directions, and that he might rush on Jenny getting up to wash and have spitted her before he had discovered that she was not a Frenchman, Mrs. Forrester said she did not think that was very likely, for he was a very sound sleeper, and generally had to be well shaken or cold-pigged in the morning before they could rouse him. She sometimes thought such dead sleep must be owing to the hearty suppers the poor lad ate, for he was half-starved at home, and she told Jenny to see that he got a good meal at night. Still, this was no confession of Mrs. Forrester's peculiar timidity, and we urged her to tell us what she thought would frighten her more than anything. She paused, and stirred the fire, and snuffed the candles, and then she said, in a sounding whisper, "Ghosts!" She looked at Miss Pole, as much as to say she had declared it, and would stand by it. Such a look was a challenge in itself. Miss Pole came down upon her with indigestion, spectral illusions, optical delusions, and such a great deal out of Dr. Ferrier and Dr. Hibbert besides. Miss Mattie had rather a leaning to ghosts, as I have said before, and what little she did say was all on Mrs. Forrester's side, who, emboldened by sympathy, protested that ghosts were a part of her religion, that surely she, the widow of a major in the army, knew what to be frightened at, and was not, in short. I never saw Mrs. Forrester so warm either before or since, for she was a gentle, meek, enduring old lady in most things. Not all the elder wine that ever was mulled could this night wash out the remembrance of this difference between Miss Pole and her hostess. Indeed, when the elder wine was brought in, it gave rise to a new burst of discussion, for Jenny, the little maiden who staggered under the tray, had to give evidence of having seen a ghost with her own eyes not so many nights ago in Darkness Lane, the very lane we were to go through on our way home. In spite of the uncomfortable feeling which this last consideration gave me, I could not help being amused at Jenny's position, which was exceedingly like that of a witness being examined and cross-examined by 2 counsel who were not at all scrupulous about asking leading questions. The conclusion I arrived at was that Jenny had certainly seen something beyond what a fit of indigestion would have caused. A lady, all in white, and without her head, was what she deposed and adhered to, supported by a consciousness of a secret sympathy of her mistress under the withering scorn with which Miss Pole regarded her. And not only she, but many others, had seen this headless lady, who sat by the roadside wringing her hands as if in deep grief. Mrs. Forrester looked at us from time to time, with an air of conscious triumph, but then she could not pass through Darkness Lane before she could bury herself beneath her own familiar bedclothes. We preserved a discreet silence as to the headless lady, while we were putting on our things to go home, for there was no knowing how near the ghostly head and ears might be, or what spiritual connection they might be keeping up with the unhappy body in Darkness Lane, and therefore even Miss Pole felt that it was as well not to speak lightly on such subjects, for fear of vexing and insulting that woe-begone trunk. At least, so I conjecture, for instead of the busy clatter usual in the operation, we tied on our cloaks as sadly as mutes at a funeral. Miss Mattie drew the curtains round the windows of the chair to shut out disagreeable sights, and the men, either because they were in spirits that their labours were so nearly ended, or because they were going downhill, set off at such a round and merry pace that it was all Miss Pole and I could do to keep up with them. She had breath for nothing beyond an imploring, "Don't leave me," uttered as she clutched my arm so tightly that I could not have quitted her, ghost or no ghost. What a relief it was when the men, weary of their burden and their quick trot, stopped just where Headingley Causeway branches off from Darkness Lane. Miss Pole unloosed me and caught at one of the men. Could not you take Mattie round by Headingley Causeway? The pavement in Darkness Lane jolts so, and she is not very strong." A smothered voice was heard from inside of the chair. "Oh, pray go on. What is the matter? What is the matter? I will give you 6pence more to go on very fast. Pray don't stop here." "And I'll give you a shilling," said Miss Pole with tremulous dignity, "if you'll go by Headingley Causeway." The two men grunted acquiescence and took up the chair and went along the causeway, which certainly answered Miss Pole's kind purpose of saving Miss Mattie's bones, for it was covered with soft thick mud, and even a fall there would have been easy, till the getting up came, when there might have been some difficulty in extraction. Thank you for listening. Do join me next time as we discover more about the goings-on in Cranford. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you want to find out what's coming up next. In a few weeks' time, we'll be starting something new. I look forward to seeing you then. Goodbye.